So let's look at what is translation and interpreting. And we often refer to translation as a metaphor to describe the very basic act of what occurs in translation. So you have this idea of carrying something over from point A to point B, or from language A to language B. So words like transport, transplant, transcribe all contribute to this idea of translation. Interpretation as metaphor is a little bit different. If we think about the way in which an interpreter acts, an interpreter will usually be in the middle of two speakers of different languages. The interpreter then acts as some kind of middleman or person, a broker, a negotiator, an explainer. So slightly different to the way in which we imagine metaphorically translation. So interpreting, of course, refers to the verbal transfer of information, whereas translation refers to the written transfer of information. In terms of translating versus translation, we need to also distinguish between product and process, and you'll be hearing this again and again throughout the course. You'll be talking or discussing products of translation, so this is the actual translation that arises or goes out into the public or is bought or sold or whatever that might be, and you might be assessed very much on the product. But you also need to think about the process of translation, which is how you get from point A to point B, the reflection that's involved, the decision making, the chopping and changing, and all of these aspects also contribute very much to the way in which we articulate translation theory. I've got some meta language here for you already. So translation changes the source text, which is also referred to in a written form as ST, in the original verbal language, which we refer to as the source language, into a written text, or we call it the target text, in a different verbal language, which then becomes the target language. So source text instead of original, target text instead of translation, source language, target language, source culture, target culture, etc. That's the way we talk about some of these very basic concepts about translation. And of course, here we're talking about interlingual translation, which is translation from one language to another. Roman Jakobson, who's a linguist working in the 1950s, came up with three categorizations of translation. As we saw in the previous slide, interlingual describes translation that occurs between two languages. So for example, English and German, Chinese and Italian, whatever those two languages might be. Intralingual is slightly different. This is described as rewording within one language system. And the best way to describe this, particularly for speakers of English, is to look at the different Englishes spoken in different parts of the world. So we're in Australia now. We speak a particular type of English, which might be different to British English, American English, or some of the Englishes that you've been exposed to in your life. So an example of intralingual translation could be the rewording which occurs when we talk, for example, about a garbage tin versus a trash can, a footpath here in Australia versus a sidewalk in America. So this kind of translation can also occur within one language system. And it might even be the case that a text, when it moves from one culture to another culture, even if the language is the same, there might be some kind of intralingual translation that needs to occur in order for that text, that target text, to function properly in its target culture context. There's also intersemiotic translation, which of course happens between different sign systems. So verbal and visual, I might say to you, hello. I might also do this. So that's an example of intersemiotic translation. We're going to pause briefly here, and I'm going to get you to do a little activity, which is to watch the following YouTube clip from an Australian comedy show called The Chasers' War on Everything. It's a very short clip, but it illustrates very well some of the aspects that Jakobson has identified in terms of the categorization of translation. So I'd like you to watch this clip and identify what kind of translation is taking place, and we'll be discussing this in our workshop.